My name is Sabine Höhler. I live in Stockholm. I work at the Royal Institute of Technology at the Division of History of Science, Technology and Environment. I am a physicist by training, but then moved into the field of history of science and technology, modern history, 19th and 20th century mainly. Also, I do environmental history, history of ecology in the 20th century. We are at the HKW, Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin Tiergarten. And we are here because it hosts a very big event called the Anthropocene Campus. It's a 10-day event bringing together about 100 doctoral students and postdoctoral students, plus about 30 teachers from all over the place, all over the world, to discuss questions of the Anthropocene. This campus is also part of a larger project that the Haus der Kulturen has hosted these past 2 years. That's called the Anthropocene Project. Our group at KTH Stockholm was invited to collaborate with the Berlin organizations, that is the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, also the HKW itself, to dive into this endeavor of creating a campus, a curriculum really for the Anthropocene, for future teaching. So it's not just for this week that we're all here together, but it's to think about, to develop a curriculum and publish it online and as an open access book later on for others to use our seminars, our seminar materials, our teaching, our questions, our pedagogical input, the students, the participants' work and replies and preparations to bring that to the world, so to speak, to use for Anthropocene teaching. And that's quite challenging, I find, because it involves so many different people from different places, and what is most challenging, of course, is the different disciplinary backgrounds that the participants have, that the teachers have from the sciences, the arts, humanities, social sciences. So this is a very diverse, also geographically diverse group of people here. It's not always easy to manage that, to handle this kind of also different expectations, different backgrounds, different expectations, different questions, and different understandings of what the Anthropocene is and what we're supposed to do about it. So I think this is what is at the heart of this event. It's also what makes it so exciting, and what makes it so important perhaps too. Because we haven't talked yet about what is the core of the project and the campus and the curriculum. It's this notion of the Anthropocene. Am I supposed to explain that then? I'm a physicist by training, so I come from the natural sciences. Originally, I was totally dissatisfied with being a scientist. I couldn't go on this way. I had to leave. I went to science studies and did history of science and technology as a PhD, and then moved into environmental studies, but historical studies, environmental history. So my field is the history of the earth sciences in the 19th and 20th century, atmospheric sciences, oceanography, and then ecology, which is like the biggest place on Earth to study living spaces of living beings. And also ecosystem sciences, systems theory, ecosystems ecology. That has been my field. My most recent research has been on the figure of Spaceship Earth. That is a very prominent metaphor and figure that came up in the 1960s and lasted about, well, say the 1980s. So it had a short lifetime in a way, but a very, very, very important, very prominent, powerful lifetime to denote the state of the Earth during the space age, let's say. These decades of the 60s and 70s, when the Cold War was in full swing and the space age and the arms race was in full swing in a way. And it was the time when the environmental movement formed in the Western world. So to denote, to call the Earth a spaceship and to think that the space capsule is an adequate model or a blueprint even to describe the fragility and the limitedness, the resource limitations of planet Earth, that could only work in a very specific time frame of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, up to the end of the Cold War, I would argue that, and then it fell apart. Nowadays, it's a figure that is not used much apart from some climate science communities. So we had new metaphors to denote the Earth, its fragility or its unitedness, like globalization, the neoliberal economy, and these very narrow, intricate communication systems that then came later in the 80s and 90s. I don't know what kind of metaphor we nowadays would have to denote to envision our planet, but this Spaceship Earth figure was really, really important in the 60s. Both from a political science perspective, looking at the Earth as a fragile planet that had to do with the balances of power, the wealth of the continents, the distribution of wealth, and also it was an engineering model of engineers and architects and their ideas to design the Earth like a space capsule with complete material recycling, with life support systems as you would use them in space flight. So in this kind of ambivalence of the spaceship figure as applied to the Earth has been my study field most recently. And I think this is what made the transition to Anthropocene research possible. When I started out working on Spaceship Earth, the Anthropocene was not even around as a discursive figure. That only came like in the 2000s. And I was still in history of science and technology. There was no talk of Anthropocene then. At some point this merged, it seems. Now Anthropocene is everywhere. Environmental history has discovered it. The environmental humanities are dealing with it, the science studies communities, sociology, history, philosophy of science have adopted this. So here we see how what I've been looking at, the spaceship as a model of the Earth during the space age, could very well also have been a part of this Anthropocene research, because we usually date the beginning of the Anthropocene to the mid-20th century, when science and technology really took off, population growth took off, resource consumption took off, the most important big studies like limits to growth came out. these alarmist notions of the Earth being a limited planet, resources being limited but being overconsumed, population growing beyond measure, beyond anything that had been known at the time, about this very narrow, closed situation of the Cold War powers. So this time that we usually identify as the beginning of Anthropocene, of the Anthropocene, when you take this beginning as being in the mid-20th century, is also the time when the engineering models of the Earth became really popular in a way. So I guess that is what also is so interesting or ambivalent about this Anthropocene notion. On the one hand, it tells us that this is the age of humankind, because, well, the impact of humankind on the planet has been so massive that we, humans, can now claim to have our own Earth age, replacing the Holocene, the previous Earth age. And that is a problem, because it tells us that there is the consequences of human action on the planet. They are so massive that we need to deal with these consequences and sometimes unintended effects. On the other hand, there is a heroic idea, I think, of what the Anthropocene might be, because it's like the end of or maybe also the beginning of a new era in which humans are the biggest players, the global players on Earth. So this ambivalence of the Anthropocene as being a threat, being perceived as a threat, it's something that we have to deal with, because it's about human impact on our planet, and perhaps impacting it in such a way that our living conditions will profoundly change. Global environmental change, climate change, the change of the state of living in the Western world. And on the other hand, there's this very heroic idea of the Anthropocene being the age in which humans come to their fullest exploration of possibilities. So I can see both aspects of Anthropocene present in the present discourse, and in a similar way that happened with Spaceship Earth as being a figure of fragility of the planet, a warning, an alarming figure, and on the other hand, a blueprint for a solution. So it's the problem and the solution at the same time. That makes it very intricate and difficult on the one hand, but it makes it also very interesting, these kind of concepts, the spaceship, the Anthropocene, because they pose very problematic and difficult questions, and we cannot easily discuss or solve them, I think. What we've been doing here these past few days in my seminar module that I've been working on with some colleagues from the sciences and also from the arts is addressing the question how we actually value nature and environment at the moment, and how we perhaps should value nature and environment in other ways than we've done before. Inhabiting the Earth, yeah, that's definitely the challenge. We do it at every moment, of course, but how we're going to do this in the future in a more conscious way without falling back to some of the mistakes I'd say the environmental era has made, that's the era, the decade of the 60s and 70s, that's the big challenge to tackle. And it still has to be decided. It has to be negotiated. So perhaps, I'm not a political scientist, but one important issue is that about negotiation between different places and parts in the world, because as we never tire to say, is that we don't all inhabit the Anthropocene in the same way. Not everyone on the planet now faces the same problems, is affected in the same way by anthropogenic climate change, by environmental changes more generally. So a lot of the problem perception and the solutions come from a very small, almost elite part of Western world or Northern Hemisphere scientific communities that cannot claim to speak for everyone on the planet. And what they perceive perhaps as the problems are not the problems that other people on the planet would perceive. So that is one problem, a problem statement that, for instance, that is very different from how the spaceship in the 60s was perceived as containing everyone in the same way, in a way. They're all crew. Today, I think we are not all the crew on our planet Earth. That is out of the question. We have to find different ways of localizing us on the planet, and not to think of humankind as being one uniform group of people with the same interests, the same problem perceptions. And that is, I think, what the Anthropocene sometimes makes invisible, because the term seems to convey to us that anthropos is just this one uniform mankind, and it's not. So in this sense, the concept is problematic, I find. We need to disaggregate. It cannot be humanity and a global we. That does not exist. That's a fiction. So this question of habitation and cohabitation in the Anthropocene has become much more difficult, I find, than the question of inhabiting a spaceship that also Western engineers and ecologists had designed and drafted and drawn up. But they also thought of humanity as being this one unit of people that somehow shared all these same interests and the same needs and wants and requirements. And I think one of the major problems will be to take that apart, this notion of one era, one humankind, one problem perception, and one way of being affected by global environmental changes. And then it's a question about negotiation. I think this is why we're here at this campus, to negotiate. It's, and what will come out of it is unclear as yet, I find, because there is the, as some colleagues call it, the triumphant Anthropocene that goes for the technical solution again. The geoengineering solutions, they're already around, and that would be one possible way out that makes the planet habitable again for the greatest number of humans. At least that's the idea. I'm very much in doubt that these approaches will do us much good, actually. Not just us in the Western world, but also humans in the global South, for instance. These solutions, I think, will not will not lead to a more habitable planet. We need to find other solutions that are not the technological, the techno-science solutions. That would be my claim in order to make the planet habitable again. But how that can be done, I don't even know. I cannot say. I'm very skeptical as to scientific technological solutions, being a historian of science and seeing that a lot of these scientific solutions were part of the problem in the first place. So how can we apply the means that caused a lot of the problems that we're nowadays facing, pesticides, nuclear power, nuclear waste, genetically modified organisms? They were all brought in as solutions to the food crisis, to the energy shortages, to fossil fuel crises, and they all came with unintended consequences that, in a way, created some of these problems that we now address as Anthropocene. So how can we seriously think that we will be able to solve these problems with similar solutions that are the very big engineering solutions for the planet, that are again often top-down solutions? They are not negotiated, they are so powerful that they have to be designed and implemented by single actors, often nation states. They don't come about through consensus decisions involving many. They are not decentralized solutions, and they very much rely on simplified models that I don't think that we can afford any longer to describe or to define and to simulate planetary life. So this is perhaps my biggest issue with some of the scientific and engineering versions of Anthropocene. Simple models, reductive models, highly aggregating models that try top-down solutions on a planet as a whole, a planet that has never been whole and is so diverse that they are bound to fail, these kind of solutions. That's my opinion. So we need more local, decentralized systems and infrastructures if we want to effect changes where they are needed. So what could they be? I guess you'll ask next. And I find they can only be in some sort of modesty that we will have to adopt. We cannot continue the lifestyles and exploitative ways of grabbing resources that we've been relying on. A lot of our progress has been relying on. So I think we need to abandon some of the. We need to abandon. Yeah, we need to abandon some of our well-beloved ideas of wealth and was really difficult. I don't know how to say this really. How I can phrase that? How I can phrase that this kind of need for local, for other solutions that don't necessarily have to be sufficiency solutions or non-technological solutions, because we cannot do without. we will have to rely on science and technology to provide solutions, but not in this sort of cybernetic sense that the Cold War sciences had envisioned for planetary management. So I don't think that Anthropocene can be about planetary management again. The historian perhaps here can provide some of these historical perspectives of what has been problematic in the past, and that we need to be careful to continue these trajectories. Then, of course, there could be people who say, well, let's colonize other planets. And it seems that some of the space age ideas are again around. When you look at flight to Mars being again a possibility or an option or a plan, a project for some people. Nowadays it's not governments but private companies who go into space and plan a Mars mission. So it seems that Anthropocene for some people takes this form and direction, which is, well, we've ruined this planet, let's go to the next. And if we want to survive, we might not be able to do it on Earth, but elsewhere. That is, like, next to geoengineering, perhaps the second worst option. Perhaps it's also the worst option. I'm not sure. So I still think that we need to make a living possible on Earth, and that requires some conscious consideration of how we want to live, how we need to live, and what we can do without, considering how well off so many parts of the Earth are and how affluent we've been living in these, well, past 60 to 100 years, really, 60 years since the post-war period. And I don't think that science and technology, being part of the problem all the time, cannot be part of the solution. I think on the contrary, they need to be part of the solution. But which solution this can be, I think, is what we're discussing here, what is just now being discussed. And the question whether the geologists will accept the Anthropocene as a geological era and confirm this kind of discourse and make it into a scientific fact or truth doesn't change a bit. It doesn't change anything about the problems and the discussions around them. They will go on, no matter what happens to that term, whether it will become a geological truth or not. So, but the discussion is still up to be led. And it's also, an event like this is designed to let people know about it. And in some sense, we already knew. There is debate on that, whether Anthropocene is a useful term, what does it add, who will it do good? And I can see both sides of this question. In environmental history, people can very well do without the Anthropocene, and many do. It doesn't really add much to our research questions and the way that we structure research. From nowadays perspective, I could say, well, my Spaceship Earth work was always also Anthropocene research, but I never termed it that. For some people, the Anthropocene adds a public dimension, I think, that might be good to have, because a lot of what we do in our humanities fields, environmental humanities, environmental history, history of science, is not really recognized or acknowledged too much. So the Anthropocene could be a very good vehicle to put some of our questions and research out in the open, because people note that there is something going on, and they realize that the way we organized our knowledge systems, or also our lifestyles, don't work the way we used to have them. They won't work that way in the future. So now different knowledges are needed. And here I think the Anthropocene can do something for us. It can convey that you need new forms of, integrated is perhaps not a good word, but sort of interrelated knowledges that are not disciplined as they used to be. Well, the sciences tell us this, the engineers can measure this for us, the architects design these kind of living spaces, the social sciences add something about political values, the humanities are basically, we afford them, but they are not useful at all. So this kind of academic disciplinarities, they are being questioned by that Anthropocene notion. And to convey that to a larger audience beyond academic and artistic or cultural studies realms is very useful, I find. It's very meaningful. It also does something to reorganize our own academic world that has been so structured and separated into different competencies and fields of expertise. And we've seen it doesn't work this way. We need to have new collaborations going on. So under the umbrella of Anthropocene, it might become possible to rearrange some of the things, to find new constellations for these new questions that perhaps a Spaceship Earth ecosystem science approach or study would not have been able to do by itself, or these separations of social sciences from humanities, from arts, from sciences, that hasn't been very, very fruitful these past decades. So here is a chance to bring something together for new answers to new questions, and also then to pose new questions. And these kind of transdisciplinary fields that are emerging here, they can well ship under this term of Anthropocene, I find. So that would be one useful thing about that terminology that is really very problematic in itself otherwise, if you think about all these justice-related distribution, environmental justice-related issues that are not addressed by Anthropocene. Everything that I said, like at the beginning of our questioning here. Yeah, I don't know if that does it for you here. Yeah, it obscures also. You know, the term obscures a lot, as I said that at the start. Anthropocene obscures that there's not just one uniform humanity going in the same direction, wanting the same things, being affected by global changes in the same way. That you always need to add when saying Anthropocene, the anthropos, who is that? That's not that one single person that can represent humankind. It's much too diverse to be represented by that somehow obscure, solid term. Well, to me, Biosphere as well as Gaia are both very much linked to the ecosystem sciences of the era that the spaceship was alive in. So I'm from that perspective, quite hesitant that they can be good models or good guiding terms for what we're trying to address now. They are too immersed in a certain technoscientific thinking, for me at least, to see them as positive or very neutral terms to use or like refill with meaning nowadays. The biosphere has a much longer history than the spaceship, since it came up in the late 19th century, was coined by the Austrian geologist Eduard Suess, actually, at the end of the 19th century, as the sphere of life that is very thin, about 10 kilometers thin, this thin sphere that surrounds the planet to a depth of like the ocean depth and the height of the breathable air. That is where life is confined to on planet Earth. Then came Vladimir Vernadsky in the 1920s and created a notion that was not so much a spatial notion but a systems notion of that biosphere as a geo-biochemical system of flows and energy transmission and material flows. So that is the beginning of turning the biosphere into something that then systems ecologists around 1970 could rediscover and again fill with new scientific meaning as a life support system of the Earth. So the biosphere as the life support system of our planet is, in my understanding, an extremely techno-scientific concept that is, it's very hard to strip these kind of spaceship meanings from it and fill it again with meanings that are much more inclusive than this geo-biochemical notion of the biosphere that has been developed since Vernadsky and then the 1970s with G. Evelyn Hutchinson, the American ecologist, who rediscovered the biosphere in that famous Scientific American issue that he published in 1970 that was called The Biosphere. And there we have the full-fledged system of closed material water mineral flows with energy input from the sun only. So it was devised like the space capsule. And ideally following these same complete material cycle flows and rules the space capsule would follow. So it's not a coincidence that we think of the biosphere as the life support system or environmental life support system. In that sense, I'm a bit hesitant. And with Gaia, it's a similar problem that Gaia is the John Lovelock figure of the Earth as a living organism that looks organic when you look at it first, but it's very much also a cybernetic, holistic cybernetic figure of the Earth as a living organism. So what I find problematic looking at the time of these early 1970s when both biosphere and the Gaia hypothesis were brought forth is that this link of cybernetic concept and holistic concepts was so strong. So you cannot read Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis without seeing that he was very much in cybernetic thoughts and frames of mind, of feedback loops and closed system dynamics. And he was a natural scientist as well. So we have these two concepts of biosphere and Gaia, and they both come from the natural sciences, and they are both very specifically framed, holistic and cybernetic, in a very intricate and also closed sense that I don't see them as being very promising for what we're dealing with now, where we want to have that integration or collaboration between very different forms of knowledges. How can we do that when we have the terms coming from the sciences, basically? So that is my concern with it. Of course, you could say, well, we can rediscover Gaia and fill it with a different with different conceptions, really reconceptualize it. But I think that's quite hard. I would rather try to find new terminology. And part of what we're doing here at this campus is also thinking about terminology for the Anthropocene. And most of the terms that we're stuck with at the moment are modernist terms. The model itself, I find, is a somewhat modernist term. They're all usually static terms to describe the Earth or our tools that we have to discuss Earth systems. And they very often come from the sciences and the engineering or design people. And what would a terminology be that does not rely on that? And that is something that is still unresolved, I find. What could that be? It must be process terms, I find. I don't know about the metaphors of the Earth. I don't know what are metaphors right now. The Anthropocene is perhaps a new metaphor. Is the Anthropocene, but it's not, it's a metaphor for ourselves. It's a temporal metaphor, right? What do you think? Oh, we have a lot of problems, no solutions. Yeah, I think we need metaphors, perhaps not just one, but it's always good to have one to put forth. Metaphors that come from different directions that are not the sciences only, but include other perspectives. And Biosphere, Gaia, the spaceship, even the planet in some sense of the post-World War planetary management ideas are fraught with certain scientific notions and meanings that I don't want to have there, or at least not exclusively. So I would look for terms that can embrace that diversity of species, of different opinions, of backgrounds, of living conditions in that earthly habitat that we inhabit together in so many ways. And I wonder whether we can find one term that can address all of that. I doubt it. Because all these terms are somehow problematic. Not one term can be so inclusive. But it would be great if we could include the humanities perspectives, for instance, on life and living together, or the social sciences perspective on social relations that are usually not addressed when you say spaceship or biosphere, with the very natural science focus, or the philosophers' perspectives of the way of living, and what does this kind of existence actually mean, and who exists, and in what way, and in which habitats do we do this. So these terms and metaphors we're looking for, perhaps they must be developed yet, should be open and and not closed. So we are not looking for closed world metaphors again. We need to look for open metaphors. And the Anthropocene in this regard could make some contribution, although I'm a bit skeptical, I must say, because it's again a term that comes from the sciences. It's a temporal term. It denotes an age, an Earth era. It does not denote the common space as much. So we'd be looking for a spatial term, I think, that still is open and does not close the world into a planet. Maybe we need a more worldly term again. There was this one world idea that was much more social relations oriented than the one Earth or whole Earth planet idea of the 1960s and 70s. So something in that vein perhaps could do something good here. That it contains the politics and doesn't exclude it from consideration. That would be my idea without having the good term, because one world has been used many times and it's maybe a bit used and overused. And then immediately come people and say, well, it's not one world anyway, so you can use the world but not the one. Because it just deflects from all the problems that we have of disunity, and that we need to take them into account as well. Crazy. So I don't know if that answered it, but yeah. At least some reflections on terminology here. How do I see the future? That's not really a simple question. That's a very hard question, I find. At the moment, I'm not really optimistic. I see our future, that is the future of all people living on Earth, as very divergent. I think that there will be few very rich people and a lot of very poor people, being those affected by global environmental change in the most heavy ways. I don't see that we will come to a balance of being affected. I rather see that we will go on increasing differences, and that I see as very problematic. I don't know what we would have to do to prevent that, what kind of supranational institutions we would have to form to make it possible that there is some sort of balancing the living conditions on all places of the Earth. But I don't think it will be possible. So there will be an increasing environmental migration. So I don't think that Europe can protect itself from that indefinitely. I see that as a huge problem. There needs to be a solution for that. I think that those gaining from capitalist market systems will increase their wealth and be very well off in very nice and secluded spaces they create for themselves, if in outer space or even on the poles, wherever, because their technology will allow them to build refuge homes in any extreme environment, I think. So that's a very negative and pessimistic forecast, of course, here from my side. But if we continue going on as we do, that is what I see happening. An increasing need to defend the few people that are well off from a growing number of poor pushing to get in and get some sort of fair share, and they won't get it. We will have energy problems, but I'm pretty optimistic that those can be solved, actually, at least for a larger part of the world. There will be food shortages, as they are now already, and I guess those are much harder to solve because there's no political will to do so. So to create these balanced ways of distributing resources, you need a political will and also institutions to make that possible. And I don't see that we're having that apart from the United Nations, of course. So I see that we'll have growing injustice, actually, environmental injustice in the world. That's my fear, and my hope is that there are enough of people conscious about these kind of changes and willing to do something about it. I still don't think that we will prevent those who can afford it to just, retreat. Retreat from the problems. So we'll have huge problems, and those who can afford to go into some sort of retreat, high-tech, clean, air-conditioned, supported systems where they can lead a good life, and a lot of environmentally caused, or anthropogenically caused environmental problems that will affect a growing number of people on this planet. That's my vision, and the hope that Europe can be somehow always distanced from that. I think that won't work. So far everything went well, so there is no that's another thing. Yeah, of course. Now, the Europeans are so nicely located here in moderate climate that they will be the last to be immediately affected by climate change problems. But we'll see the secondary effects through increasing migration pressures, and then what? So that is what I see coming, and I don't have a really good solution apart from those bottom-up solutions that we're trying to create at this event here and also elsewhere, because if we don't have a consciousness and awareness about that, people will just go on doing what they always did and consuming as they always did, and living beyond measure as they always did in the West. That's a very... Now I sound like the scientists that I studied in the 1960s and 70s that created all these alarmist ideas of the world collapsing very soon because of over-exploitation of resources and population growth and increasing pollution. And I don't want to sound like them, really, but rather, well, I guess I cannot avoid to sound like them, but I'm looking at, I'd rather focus on the political issues and social issues that I think will come up first. The environment, of course, can do very well without us, but it's going to be the social conflicts that I think will be what has to be handled. And I wonder whether we are able to do it, whether we are equipped to do this. As far as I can see at the moment, we're not equipped to do it. If you look at increasing resource, wars, economic migration, environmental migration, climate refugees, it always boils down to social justice questions, and those we haven't sufficiently tackled yet. That's a very dismal outlook, I guess. Maybe you should not put that into an interview.